I'm a gospel doctrine teacher in my ward, and when we do the Old and New Testaments, they're shot through with humor that's
Mm.
very insightful. And Joseph Smith was a part of that tradition of telling really wild, provocative jokes to make a point. And the jokes that he made were comments along the lines of, I would rather be in hell with my friends than in heaven alone. And in a couple of different junctures, he said pretty much exactly that. Like,
Hmm.
you can send me to hell as long as I can take my friends with me. And I don't want to be in heaven all alone. So you're tying it back to this notion that being eternally okay, maybe that's the translation for all this stuff we're talking about: salvation, sanctification, and exaltation. What we're really
Eternally
saying
okay.
is, are
Mm-hmm.
you eternally okay? Are
Hmm.
you whole with a scope that's eternal? And then we
Hmm.
can work out the specific details of it. But Joseph Smith was making a pretty strong argument that you can't be whole alone.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to The Soloists. I'm Mallory Everton, and I'm here with my friend Diana Brown. And today we are interviewing Dr. Samuel Brown.
Hello, Sam. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to, glad to. It's good to be with the cool kids for a change, I guess.
Yeah, Mallory's cool. I don't
Oh,
know about.
stop it. Diana, you're
Nah, you're
so
both
cool.
cool.
Don't cut yourself short.
um, okay, well, I'm excited, very excited to have you here, Sam, because you're well, okay, you're a very dexterous person professionally. I don't know how many people, Matt, you're a doctor, you're a medical researcher, you're also a cultural historian and have written several books on religion. And one of your books on Mormon history is like one of my all-time favorites in terms of just speaking to these parts of my heart that my religion has animated that I've never felt it like had been quite expressed so well anywhere else, which is how Mormonism speaks so profoundly to the problem of human loneliness. And that more than just a religion that is interested in purifying people from sin or figuring out some metaphysical questions about the universe, that it wants to figure out like how we belong to each other, and it wants to celebrate the intimacy and joy of human relationships, where the weight and the meaning and the beauty of them just seems to burst the bounds of any kind of language you have for it. And I feel like Joseph Smith felt that. I mean, your book is called, the book that I've been talking about, In Heaven as It Is on Earth: Joseph Smith and the Early Mormon Conquest of Death. And one of the points that you make so clear is that we wanted to start living in a society in relationships ordered as they would be in the next life, but also so that whatever relationships await us in the next life, that we could start to enjoy them now. And also, like, how did we get so lucky that we get this now? We need language and we need ritual to try and be able to express this
Yeah.
somehow. So that's obviously been on my mind and heart as Mallory and I have been working on this project and thinking about singleness, and those of us who don't fit into a traditional nuclear family at this time in our lives and can sometimes feel sort of like cut off. I just think Joseph Smith's vision for relationships was so expansive and so joyful. And so anyway, your writings and your work on in Mormon history has just been really helpful to me in thinking through this question.
Thanks, Diana. Most people over the years have said of that book, I had to buy a thesaurus, and that's the end of the conversation.
Oh.
So to hear that you got the book and that it was useful to you really is heartwarming. If I still had blush glands, I would be blushing
You've
because
lost your blush glands?
that's a dad joke. That is a dad joke.
Okay,
I have
okay.
fully intact physiological blush glands, I
Oh,
assume,
that's
but I
good to
don't know that
know.
I blush very much. But that's thank you. That means a lot, and it resonated. I'm sure we'll wander a lot of different places, but after my wife Kate died, it was common that people would reassure me, and even some very nice widowers would reach out and talk about how they'd had a visitation from their wife, their postmortal life, their wife, or they knew that they would be together again. And And my Kate knew of a certainty, very specifically, of the shape of the persistence of human consciousness, and
Mm,
I was so grateful for that. That's not something that comes naturally to me. I honor it, accept it, love it, and it's not something I realized after she died. That was at the core of the gospel message for me
mm,
in terms of thinking through and experiencing the grief. What I realized was that miracle that we have ever lived and that we have ever had the capacity to love in a vast way that brought meaning to our love of, what was it, almost 27 years, that it was in the very experiencing of it eternal, no matter what the
mm.
specific shape of consciousness might be in the afterlife. And again, I'm not trying to say I don't believe in an afterlife. What I'm trying to describe is what my heart resonates to. And what my heart
Yeah.
resonates to is that sense of vastness simultaneous with the living of it. And your comment reminds me of this miraculous fact of her existence and of our love and the children we created together that is itself in the living of it eternal. And that
Mm.
was the assurance the gospel brought to me, that no matter what afterlife looks like, and I earnestly hope that she's right. And
Well, Sam, while we're gushing about your writing, I actually I have not read your previous books, but I read Where the Soul Hungers during the pandemic, and I encountered a conversation that you had with Kate, I believe, on I think it was what is that? The All In podcast, I'm pretty sure.
oh yeah, yeah,
And
Morgan.
yeah, yeah, it was a lovely conversation. In fact, there was something that you said that I feel like maybe your grandfather shared with you about the fact that we're always living either in the light or in the memory of the light that I think
Oh
about
yeah,
almost daily.
yeah.
And there was it a lot. I mean, I really, really enjoyed. I enjoyed where the soul hunger so much, and it was in part because of this posture that you have sometimes referred to as being sort of naturally atheistic or agnostic. And I've always
Oh,
felt that way myself, that I've chosen to be a person of faith, and that it helps me to talk with other people who also see the benefit in making choices to try and engage in a faith community that doesn't always feel like their natural mode, but I still feel quite drawn to it regardless. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. I really
oh.
appreciate
Uh, just the last 10 years at some level beat the crap out of me,
it. Yeah.
and
Mm.
you figure out what the outcome of that will be. I think the glib Nietzschean, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, blah blah blah, I think that's not accurate. But I do think when something terrible happens, you have a choice to make, and
Yes.
the choice is, what shall we make beauty and holiness from this, or shall we
Mm-hmm.
not? When Kate's cancer first came, she lost her eye, and the first surgery failed, and the second one, and suddenly we were confronted with her disability. It didn't prove permanent, but it was extremely difficult for 3 or 4 months. And I'd always just been a busy academic physician working 80 hours a week, loving everybody that I was supposed to love and being faithful to covenants and all that, but gone, right?
Mm.
Academic physicians are mostly gone from their private lives. And as we tried to figure out what belonging to each other meant, I realized that I had been failing. And that devastated me emotionally, to think that this woman that I loved so much had been hurt by me, and not just once, but serially hurt. That
Mm.
really broke me. And then I had to figure out, am I going to make holiness and beauty from this or not? And so that started a process of retooling. And then when her cancer occurred, and I lost her, uh, that was a different kind of brutality, that I had to figure out, what holiness, what beauty will we make here.
Yeah.
And I think I realized through that process that what I can offer is being honest and thoughtful, and sharing my experience, recognizing
Mm.
that for, I think, the majority of Latter-day Saints, my experience is odd,
Mm.
probably belongs in a cabinet of curiosities. But for
Mm.
a substantial minority of Latter-day Saints, it's helpful. And so that
Yeah.
I've tried to just be open and honest and thoughtful, and sharing. So I'm glad to hear, Mallory, that it's been of use.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in being generous with our oddities. I don't think we don't need to be aliens in the same way to feel less alien, to find out someone else feels alien in a different way, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so often those parts that we're like, oh, this is really not what I want to talk about. As soon as we do, it's usually where, where the connection is. Um, can I ask a follow-up question on what you said? You were saying you face a choice. It sounds like you can either go into default mode when the crap happens, or you can, I can't remember how you said it, but make things holy. What does that mean exactly? Like what is that choice you were talking about, and what did it look like on either side?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think um, I did not cause Kate's cancer.
Hmm.
If anything, by working really hard and calling around the country and finding the right clinical trials, I got her a couple extra years of life, which we treasured and valued. So Kate's cancer was not up to me, and it was horrifying. It was so terrible.
Mm.
And then I have a question that I've got to answer. Will that horror make me angry and alone and judgmental? And sometimes it did.
Mm.
There were a few people that I was honestly quite rude to. And I felt that I was justified because I was the one whose effing wife was dying of cancer person.
Right.
But that was a choice.
Mm.
I could choose to be mean, and no one, honestly, people wouldn't judge me. Like, it's all over the interwebs. If somebody is nosy or somebody reads you a Hallmark card or somebody's silly, you have every right as an aggrieved person, as a devastated person, as a
Yeah.
traumatized person. You have every right to lash out, to mock, to distance, to separate, to judge and criticize.
Hmm.
And I did. I have. Absolutely. I freely admit that. And as I wandered through that grief, I I realized that I I actually had a choice. And the choice was, do I pause and do I think this person has a sadness of their own? And my experience is most people who misbehave are misbehaving out of something that's hard for them, that they're not quite sure how to manage, that they're not quite sure what to do about.
Yeah.
There are so few purely malicious people. I mean, we hear about them and we imagine they're behind every corner, but the reality is there are so few truly malicious people. There are lots of wounded people who do things that look pretty malicious,
Hmm.
but when you scratch the surface, they've got a grief. So
Yeah.
then that was my choice. Do I take the time? Do I gird up my loins? Do I tie up my wound with a bandage, a tight bandage, and respond in kindness?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's something, um, like you were saying, when you are grieving in such an objectively justified and horrific way, the world really gives you permission almost to excuse yourself from anything, and you recognize that choices remained regardless, and that's a hard thing to admit at a time like that.
Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong, I was
that's.
super mean to some people. I really was. And
Mm.
I regret it now. And at the time, I just felt powerless. Like, people
Yeah.
who come up, how are you?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, my wife just died. My oldest daughter just got diagnosed with cancer, and my youngest daughter is institutionalized for suicidal depression. How the FCK do you think I'm doing?
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
So there were moments where I really was quite mean. It kind of happens when you're overwhelmed sometimes. And
Yeah.
then I introspected and said, no, this is not this is not the sanctity of Kate's life. This is not the sanctity of my kids' lives. This is not the glory and beauty of ever having been ensouled, of being a conscious human being.
Yeah.
That's not it. It's
Mm-hmm.
not it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a deliberate choice to recognize.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like in a situation like that, and some comes up and really wants to know how you are, whether and or not that's really what's going on, is that they're almost wanting to be able to tie up your situation in a bow somehow, to be able to tell some kind of story about it that makes sense, to not feel completely annihilated by the unfairness of life. And that feels like such an affront when you're just overcome by the unfairness of life and want people to potentially step into that reality with you instead of trying to make your life okay somehow or use it as some kind of personal ego story. The strange thing about it is it's almost like everything we're experiencing is some kind of phase or stage of grief or denial. Like if denial is a phase of grief and these people are in denial about their own pain about being alive, then we're all sort of grieving this like constant awareness that life is just brutal and like love is coming out sideways in all of these grief stricken ways, and sometimes we yell at each other about it, and it just feels like this insanely beautiful mess to me as I hear you describe
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. There was a moment. There was a moment when it kind of hit me. Oh, they want to know that if their spouse ever gets cancer,
Yeah.
they want to know that it's possible to survive terrible grief. And
Mm.
that can be my witness to them that it's possible to survive terrible grief. And then I thought, oh, I'm not doing this well. I'm so pissed sometimes. I'm so overwhelmed. Some days I don't even think I can get out of bed. But you know what? I'm surviving. I'm making it. And what they want to know, I think most of them, what they want to know is when the time comes, can I make it? And that's a kind of Christian witness back to them because
Yeah.
Jesus says, yeah, you can make it. And that decision is about the witness of Jesus that we've got this. And it's scary to think you might not be able to make it. And in the ICU, I see people who don't make it.
Yeah.
I see people whose lives utterly collapse into substance use disorder and terrible psychiatric decompensation after something sad. And they are deserving of love and respect and admiration, just like everyone else. And people are afraid that when something terrible like that comes, they won't have that strength. So if we
Mm-hmm.
can, in a non-sanctimonious way and in a non-belittling way, I think that's a witness we can bring to them that, you know what, bad things can happen and it can be okay. It can even be beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's probable, it's I think it's hopeful to know it's possible.
I went through a phase when people were like, how are you? I said, well, if I had any advice for you, it's don't kill your wife,
Mm-hmm. It's
Mm.
right?
great
It's the
great
gallows
advice.
humor that you're allowed as a widower. And it was just my way of saying, you know what? If you can avoid it at all costs, do not lose a beloved to death.
Yeah.
And then they look at me like I just ate a live frog in front of them, and I'd think, oh, well, okay. And then you get a little better, you know. But it's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah. It's
I don't eat live frogs, by the way. That was just some sort of outlandish metaphor,
I
just for
don't
the
yeah.
believe you.
record.
I think you do.
Oh man, I have eaten French, dead frogs. That the French eat a lot of cool things, I have to say.
They really do. If you roll it in enough butter, you can eat pretty much anything.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
that's very true. We read a piece that you wrote in BYU Studies Quarterly called Believing Adoption, which you thought was like a sort of accessible reading that was talking about some of the personal impact and insights from your studies on how you live as a Latter-day Saint. And why don't I read, this was a line that struck me as a good summary of your argument here. You said the prophet, referring to the prophet Joseph Smith, the prophet was moving away from traditional Christian ideas about salvation and law. He was saying something about salvation that existed in the creation of durable family relationships. Being bound to heaven meant being bound to other people. True conversion was no isolated encounter between a single penitent believer and the mighty God. It was the creation or a it was the creation of or integration into a family. And this was so helpful in helping me make sense of something in our tradition, which is this distinction that we have between salvation, which the broader Christian family all talks about, believes in, has been arguing for years what that means, and this concept of exaltation, which I'm not actually familiar if there's roots of that language in other traditions, but that we have like a layer on top of salvation, which has to do with your relational status. And as we're saying, like sort of how that gets inflected on this life as well. So I guess, do you want to talk about that? And mainly, what do you think is at stake in this difference?
You did something cool there, Diana, that's fun and that I had not done before. You suggested that exaltation might be Mormonization of salvation in a relational mode, and I like that. I'm a gospel doctrine teacher in my ward, and when we do the Old and New Testaments, they're shot through with humor that's very insightful. And Joseph Smith was a part of that tradition of telling really wild, provocative jokes to make a point. And the jokes that he made were comments along the lines of, I would rather be in hell with my friends than in heaven alone. And in a couple of different junctures, he said pretty much exactly that. Like, you can send me to hell as long as I can take my friends with me. And I don't want to be in heaven all alone. So you're tying it back to this notion that being eternally okay, maybe that's the translation for all this stuff we're talking about: salvation, sanctification, exaltation. What we're really
Eternally
saying
okay.
is, are you eternally okay?
Mm-hmm.
Are you whole with a scope that's eternal? And then we can work out the specific details of it. But Joseph Smith was making a pretty strong argument that you can't be whole alone. And then you open up this really interesting sense that's really rich in restoration theology, and that is the idea that the purpose of life, the being okay now and forever, is learning to give yourself the way a parent does to another person. Jesus models that. There are images in Scripture, including in our Scripture, including in the Book of Mormon, that talk about Jesus as a parent, not just as an older brother. And what they're getting at is that notion that Jesus' relationship to us is a parent-like relationship. And what's telling here is that, yeah, it's a parent-like relationship, but Jesus isn't our dad. And that opens up this possibility that I think is all through the early restoration and is part of Joseph Smith's defiance of evolving Victorian social norms about the family, that says that we're called to love each other the way a parent does. For some of us, we get to be a biological parent, and that's cool. The calling's the
Yeah.
same. The calling is the same, whether you're a biological parent or a legally adoptive parent or an aunt or an uncle or a neighbor or a member of a ward family. The calling is to adopt people the way Jesus
Yeah.
adopts us. So it may be that the adoption is of a sibling. It may be that it's of a friend, someone that you've grown to be with. But the point about it being hard is it's got to be a love that is able to be inconvenienced, to be stretched, to be driven nuts.
I'm looking at the table of contents
Oh,
on your book and just like recalling the impression that it left on me. So we're talking about this, adoption theology and practices and ordinances and teachings of the restoration, and the kind of imagination that it invoked that was making space for such an expansive notion of family, right? And then making sure we would not only be connected eternally to our offspring and to our immediate families, but that we could like graft in our friends and our ancestors and all of these things. And I'm looking through the table of contents on your book and remembering how curious he was about dead people and the lives that they had lived. And not only dead people, but dead peoples, and the
Yeah.
lost cultures and languages, and his sort of like lust for understanding them and trying to bring them back into relevance to the extent that he could. And in that spirit, that's one way in which we're invited to pursue family history, for example, is not just out of duty or obligation, but this like desire to understand what were the worlds that they, our ancestors came from, and the ways that the gospel manifests in their life and the things that they enjoyed or whatever. And I guess it's interesting, this notion of family as the people you sacrifice for. But there's also the why you do that. And I suppose there's also this meaning of family is because they're there and they're interesting and it's worth being curious about them. And that's why you're willing to sacrifice for them.
Yeah, I think one of the things I love the most about really diving into that theology was understanding a little bit more about this notion of the saviors on Mount Zion. And you get this sense, or I got this sense as I was reading this material, that what he really meant by the saviors on Mount Zion are the people who bring the people they love the way a parent loves a child to this grand banquet at the end of time that will be on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And Jesus will be there, and we will all be there, and we will be sitting at a long table, and we will be holding each other, and we'll be eating. And presumably we'll be eating bread and wine, but maybe we'll also be eating a Paschal lamb, or maybe we'll all be vegetarians then, I don't know. But it will be this grand feast. I kind of feel like that's what we're looking for at Mount Zion, that sense of just being together and so grateful to see each other again. And I get the sense that the saviors on Mount Zion are the people who bring others to that grand feast at the end of times when we're all together again. We're not trying to be friends like the TV show Friends. That's not what we're called as Latter-day Saints to do and be. It's not just somebody you hang out with and you enjoy each other. It's somebody you really love and you really allow them to shape you, and hope that they allow you to shape them. And the easiest way into that is biological parenthood. That just seems to be a fixed feature of the universe. That's the easiest way into those kinds of relationships. It seems to be deep in our biology, evolutionarily. Yes, that's what it is. But that's the easiest one. It's not the only one. But what the gospel says is we are more than biology. All of us are called to be adoptive parents in that gospel sense. And I think that we sometimes forget that fact.
I can
I'm
imagine.
I'm curious, Sam. Like there feels like there's so much here that feels extremely global and sort of eternal, and some that feels more personal. And I was wondering if you would be able to get maybe slightly more concrete about what would you think would be useful to us today about it, and how can
Yeah,
adoption theology be helpful to the modern Latter-day Saint
that's
or
the
person?
yeah. I'm fortunate to have had an experience that makes it a little bit cleaner for me. I was raised by a single mom and didn't have a dad in my life, and then he actually fully died. And we were in a lower middle class Mormon ward in Davis County in the 80s, and they loved us and took care of us. And I developed friendships with men whom I have loved since we were 13 years old, so 40 years. And the relationships that I have with these 5 or 6 men are uh, core to me. They're, they're men I love uh, deeply and fully, and we mourn with each other. And when one of us goes through something terrible, and I'm not the only one who's had to go through something terrible, we rally and look out for and make sacrifices for in a in a way that I think astonishes a lot of people. And so, honestly, a lot of what I think about this adoption theology in practical terms is based on my experience of these guys. I call them the boyhoods. They call themselves he dudes. Taking the risk, and it's hard, and it's a ton of work, and it doesn't always work out, and there are always extenuating circumstances and competing interests and vulnerabilities, but being open to really loving someone the way you love a family member, and then making it more than an affinity connection. I think that restoration theology says we should figure out how to build relationships that can tolerate the disruptions of those ties of affinity. And I think that's our restoration resonance of that old New Testament teaching, that if you love the people that are just like you and that treat you solid, that's not all the way there.
Yeah.
So that's what I've tried to figure out. And for me, it's been the boyhoods and a couple of other friends where I just said, you know what, even if we're living far apart, even if we're not the same anymore, we are connected, and I'm going to take care of you. And there are limits to it. You can only do it for so many people. That here I gotta confess a heresy, unless you don't want me to confess a heresy.
Oh,
We
we're
But
here
want it.
for it.
the New Testament, who's your neighbor? Uh, and Jesus is everybody's your neighbor. Buck up. I keep thinking there's a moment in the Karamazov brothers where this woman says that it is trivially easy to love the people in general and almost impossible to love specific people. And if I
Hmm.
remember right, it's playing on, in Russian, there's narod, which means the people, and then there's люди, which means people, concrete people, and she's distinguishing that. And there's a sense in which when I hear that, who's your neighbor, it's everybody, I think of that woman in the Karamazov brothers who says it's effortless to love everybody in the abstract, right? And
Yeah.
I think we all know people who say, "Hey, everybody's your neighbor. Think global. You got to love everybody. You got to love the stranger. You got to love the everything." And then no one can be in their presence for more than 15 minutes because they're so mean, right?
Hmm. This is, yeah, go ahead, Mallory.
Well, I was just gonna say we have limited hours a day in the day. We have limited capacity. It only makes sense that you have to choose who you're going to invest your love in. But I are you going to forget your idea, Diana? Because I have a question that is troubling me that I can
Oh,
ask after if you know if you would like to go
okay.
first.
I'll ask this part just because it's on the nose, and then we'll switch
Sure,
gears.
sure.
Maybe they're connected. Um, I was just gonna say, yeah, when I think about this question, I mean, there's a part of me that wants to think like, oh, this is so beautiful. Like all of these restoration things have made it so there's like less pressure on us to like form families actually, and like we can just treat our friends as family and have chosen family and affinity based relationships and lean into all of these community things and all of those things. Like yes, 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 we should be doing all of that. It's really great and there is space for it. But there's a part of me that that also knows that, part of the reason why I'm not married is like I haven't been able to tolerate the friction that has been produced with anybody that I've dated. Like just being perfectly honest. I come from I don't know if it's a generational thing where in some ways I think we're kind of trained to be hypersensitive about like what we problematize friction that frankly family requires, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's like, oh, he doesn't treat me the way that I want to. Well, oh my gosh, like I don't know what spouse who's been married longer than like isn't that probably almost always true in some sense? And you have to figure out like is this within a range of normal, or is this like genuinely abusive or whatever? But like I don't know, in retrospect, looking at some things, some situations that I rejected in my 20s, I sometimes think like, you know what? We probably could have just grown up together and things would have been just fine. But I was like hypersensitive and hyper aware and very fearful, you know? And anyway, I I sense a lot of trends in the way that like younger people are taught to think about relationships that basically problematizes very normal friction that you experience in intimate relationships. And and there is something about biology and marriage that like forces you into that space that when everything is based on your choice, you're kind of probably never going to go there. And a lot of friendships break up once they get to that point too, where like a friend is, you know, pushing beyond the limits of what you want, right? Actually, this was a line that I pulled that I thought was really good. You said, perhaps that sometimes desperate dance between the chosen and the inescapable is part of the work of making us divine, you know, and sort of as talking about this dance between like biological family and just sort of happenstance family and then chosen family that obviously so many restoration teachings are speaking to, like we want both of these. Anyway, that's a concern that I have about this concept of chosen family, and something that, you know, it's really easy if you lean too far in that direction to remove yourself from situations that provide that really healthy kind of friction, and that's probably where the growth happens and presumably the depth and I don't know, the
100%. And
joy.
that you've done a much better job of putting into words what I was gesturing toward when I said we got to love people who are hard.
Hmm.
That's
Mm,
what I was talking about. That adoption calls us to choose and then stay.
yeah.
And it's that movement from choosing to staying to creating something that has to tolerate difficulty that I'm talking about. That I had, here's a weird story. This guy turns to me at church basically and says, I decided to divorce my wife because I watched you and Kate and I knew that uh, we could never have such a great relationship.
Oh.
And I thought, well, A, that's a super weird thing to say. And B, Kate and I have a hard marriage.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
a hard marriage. We hurt each
Hmm.
other's feelings. We are often like oil and water. Like,
Mm.
I sometimes make Kate cry. She sometimes makes me feel alone. Like, we had a wonderful marriage and we had a hard marriage.
How could it not be
And
like oil and water the
yeah,
closer you get to anybody?
Right. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I noticed that I mean, the scholars like to call it companionate marriage, and they're opposing it
Hmm.
to dynastic or familial or arranged marriage, and et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
The reality is that the myth of companionate marriage, that it's your soulmate and you make love and you go on picnics and then you die together at 90 and nothing's ever been hard. BS, right? It's not a thing, and it's even toxic
Yeah.
BS because it creates expectations that are just not true. There,
Hmm.
I mean, I've been a little bit scared of getting married again, in part because I remember how hard it was to be married.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not because I didn't love and don't love Kate, and not
Hmm.
because for a moment I regret marrying her. Um, so as I've been pondering what marriage again will look like, um, I've been a little scared, and it's taken me working through the grief to have the strength to say, yeah, I'm ready for the hard stuff. And I think, Diana, you're right that there are a variety of cultural motifs and constraints in the way people grow and people interconnect and people think. And social media is fueling some of it, but it's not all of it. That is disruptive. So I think it would, to your point, be a misreading of restoration theology to say that what we're really talking about is friendsgiving forever.
Right.
We're not. We're not
Mm-hmm.
at all. We're talking about leaning into hard relationships. And you
Mm.
flag something that's very important and that's sometimes sort of confusing. You don't lean into actually abusive relationships.
Sure.
If somebody's actually being abused, you put the dude in jail and you get the person out, right? That's pretty straightforward. The problem is that at moments of intense emotional distress, the lines blur
Mm.
for a lot of us. And stuff that is just the natural give and take of humans. How do we figure out how to protect people who are being actually abused and help the rest of us have the resilience and the staying power to get through what you've termed friction, which
Yeah.
is, I think, an apt term. And that's, it's super, it's
Yeah.
super hard.
Well said. The hmm Hmm. Mallory, can you save this problem?
I wish I could because you basically asked my question. It was something I was troubled by as I was reading about. I loved the way that you expressed the tension basically of when you have a nuclear family. It's you said such commitments do not come naturally to us, particularly when we perceive competition between the broader world and our own families, kind of speaking to the idea that it's very easy to be protective of almost like the ego story of our nuclear family and seeing that as something that needs to be cultivated. And then you said, on the other side, responsibilities to the outside world can become a convenient excuse for a man who thrives on the praise of outsiders and fears his own inability at home. We should be aware.
Mm.
We should beware the invocation of the love of humanity as a cloak to hide the sins of pettiness and selfishness, the inability to relate to those with whom we live directly. And I won't lie, a big bubble of emotion rose up for me as I felt, am I close enough to anyone to really be able to put this into practice? And I do have some very, very close relationships, but I had a sibling a couple months ago point out something very painful about one of my best friends. She and I became friends when we were like 14 or 15. And I'm from Portland and I moved to Utah when I was 18. And I haven't lived in the same state with her since. And I'm 35 now. So it's been a good long time. And we're still best friends. We still catch up whenever I go home for Christmas when we have this very tight friendship. And he made a comment. He said, well, yeah, it's easy to stay close to someone when you never have to live near them. And I felt horror and sadness and pain over it. The idea that, like, oh, wow, are all my friendships this way? Like, kept at
Hmm.
arm's length enough because I'm a single woman who actually has this whole harem of incredible women all over the country and actually in other countries as well that I hit up occasionally. And like, I get my needs met
Right.
by like 20 different people in a week because I don't have just one. And trying to think about, am I adopting any of them? Or am I just at a very convenient distance to stay very lovable? And it's a very convenient type of love that I have with everyone. I have no answer. I just have a little bit of fear about this right now. So,
And I just want
Yeah.
to echo Mallory, so well said. I have the same fear for myself, right? That, like, as beautiful as I want to make all my friendships and these people I adopt and my nieces and nephews, it's not lost on me that all of them are very conveniently distant as well. And we definitely suffer for that. It's lonely, and we want that intimacy, but there's also so much that I don't know, we're spared as well in terms of like that friction and that growth. And oh, you just said that really well. That resonated with me a lot.
yeah.
And the reality is that most of us are situated and or cultivated in a way that all the people you're interacting with are likely interacting with somewhat overlapping networks in much the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, how do you sort out that kind of deeper adoptive connection? Because we need training wheels. Diana, earlier you talked about the structures of communal life that structure our encounter with the outrageous beauty of life and the possibility of relation. There's a sense in which we need systems to make it's so weird in our contemporary society to grab one of your people and turn them into an adoptive relationship. And so the question is, what are the ritual structures or the community forms that will conduce to the development of those kinds of relationships? And the reality is, we use marriage and then parenthood in a different way as the formal, legal binding, not as binding as it used to be, but binding nonetheless. And how do we simultaneously create conditions that make it pretty natural for most of us, even those of us that are scared or worried or a little bit concerned about it, to enter into flourishing marital relationships, and recognizing that that's not a path, even when it's done well at a societal level, that's going to work for everybody. What other paths do we have for that kind of connection? Go back to these wards, but then what I hear from single friends. So I am fully cognizant of two core things. One, I'm biologically male, and singleness in the Latter day Saint tradition is way easier for dudes than it is for women. I acknowledge that. I
Thank you.
it's easier to be a widower, I think, in some respects, than to be a divorcee or a never married. Like, people sort of treat you like you're okay, just something sad happened to you, rather than, oh, why'd you get divorced? What's the
What'd you
problem
do
there?
wrong?
Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
why did you
How is
never
this
get
your
married?
fault?
What's your deal? So I want to be mindful that, as sad as my walk has been, there are plenty of people who have a much more complicated or painful walk of it. That's my way of just saying, for me, it feels like the Mormon ward ought to be some of that ritual structure for those deeper connections, recognizing that I may be inclined to think that way because I have this really awesome ward that's incredibly nurturing and integrates me into stuff. I am also mindful that wards sometimes really struggle about it. I get the vibe that for single women, um, the marrieds have a hard time figuring out how to integrate them into stuff. And I don't know the whole dynamics there. Is it like, oh, is my husband gonna look twice here? Like, is there
Sure.
that kind of vibe going on? Or is it just that people are so tired trying to keep their kids afloat that it's not as natural? Kate and I always tried to make sure that we loved lots of different flavors of people and included them to the extent we could into the cycle of our lives. So did have a fair number of single friends that would be a part of our experience day to day or at holidays or whatever. I'm hearing that it's not universal that happens, and that is an area where I
Mm-hmm.
think Mormon wards could rise to the occasion a little bit better. We're trying to figure out what are the ritual and community structures that will help us to
Mm-hmm.
a
Yeah.
be open to marriage as it happens, and be open to truly flourishing independent of whether marriage happens. I think that's what we're after.
Yeah, I
But it's
agree. That's the question.
I know that. I mean, Diane and I have talked about this a little bit, as I and I don't know if I'm um, bringing in an unnecessary metaphor, but we've talked about moving into our 30s and feeling kind of more like we're moving into mother roles in our lives, regardless of whether or not we have biological children to mother. There's a sense that we have more wisdom to offer and more love to offer than maybe we did before. There's more space in our souls, and sort of our arms can get around more than they used to be able to. And I have felt a sort of tug occasionally when maybe a previous version of myself would have said, "This person's toxic. I'm out." Which I would say is like the
Toxic.
cry of the past 10 years, right? Like, cut them out. They hurt your feelings.
Yeah.
They're gone, you know?
Yeah.
Yes.
But lately I have felt more of a call to say, I think I want to belong to this person and I want them to belong to me too. And
Mm.
I think that I need to go deeper here.
Uh,
Most of the time for me, it's been in either church service or in my work because I partner with people often in my work. Um, and creative, collaborative work can be quite personal and it can get really dicey sometimes. And occasionally, like turning toward that disruptive energy has been really gratifying for me. And so I think that's something I want to challenge myself to do. There's the part of me that's very afraid that somehow I've spent my life avoiding being too disturbed by any man. And so I'm taking baby steps with myself and thinking, well, keep practicing every time you feel even the slightest tug of hope that this is not a reason to write this person off completely, but a reason to go deeper together and to adopt them a bit more as someone I can offer some more generous love.
Yeah. About, again, back to this question, Valerie, of us being sort of haunted by like, have we just avoided friction and now
Right.
we're like never going to have the heights of, I think sometimes about the tension in religious Western religious history. This will often be uh, a distinction people draw between like Protestantism and Catholicism, or like what was at stake with the Protestant Reformation, which was um, a leaning away from ritual towards this emphasis on the spirit and the individual leading things. There was this kind of sense or of dissatisfaction that people had been feeling around um, how much space that a highly liturgical, ritual soaked religious experience was giving for individual expressions of the spirit. And basically, there's just this tension. And Mormonism is a very interesting wedding of the two because we both have this like very romantic sense of the individual and their own capacity to access God. And we also are a very like ritual heavy tradition that believes in like priesthood power and the vitality and necessity of ordinances and all of that. And so wedding the two is what most Christian traditions are trying to figure out how to do. And we have our own way of doing that. But basically that there's this tension there. And I think, we're sitting with this question of ourselves as like, okay, well, we don't have as many like ritually supported relationships. And we're in this more of like a free floating, like let the spirit guide kind of space. And we're recognizing there are real limitations if this is just like left to its own devices. And maybe it's just a moment to remember too, though, that there's opportunities for us here that we're able to access precisely because we're positioned the way we are. So I guess for me, just to make it more concrete, uh, I feel for sure grateful for being single for so long because I think if I had gotten married a long time ago, I just know how I would have been. Like, I just think I've grown up a lot and I've
Mm.
learned to take so much more responsibility. And I'm at a stage in my life where I'm realizing what's at stake here. Like, I really do have to choose my family and I have to be serious about treating them like family. Do not treat my friends as people who will come and go. Like, how do I make these the sacred things that they are? And I think that's come because of loneliness and because like of the sanctifying fire of like, oh geez, I'm alone and I don't know what's going to happen in my life and like I need to take accountability. And I know myself. I know if I'd gotten married a lot younger, I'm sure I would have grown up in all sorts of ways that I would have been grateful for, but I think I would have had a tendency to just like avoid myself and my own accountability because you kind of can. Yeah, and I just feel like I've reached these moments of growth for me where I just enough moments where it's like, Diana, you've got nobody to be accountable for, and nobody is responsible for your life but you, and you need to make it like what you need it to be. And anyway, I do see in this like wrestle between like, do you need the ritual and the social structure, or do you need like your own individual showing up to the lifeness? We need both of them, but I think that there's a lot to be said about leaning into the gifts, the spiritual gifts that are available to us, and the the truths about relationships that teaches us. And social structure and social support is vital for relationships, but that can also be stultifying and distract you from like, from waking up to your own responsibility and things.
Yeah, I think the reality is that a few things are true. One, marriage is fantastically awesome and important. Two, we're not married people and single people.
Right.
We're these luminous divine beings who live in an environment of opportunity and
Mm-hmm.
accident and culture and community and deliberation and tragedy and happiness. And the reality is that those labels, those identities, married, single, whatever it is you are, they're a part of the story of our lives, but they're not the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is that we are these divine beings called to love, and we'll love in many different ways. And we'll want to love sometimes, and we won't be. I want to keep loving and being married to Kate.
Yeah.
I do. That seems like a worthy aspiration, and I can't. She's dead. And I can honor the fact that that's sad, and I can love as Kate's widower. I was called to parent Kate, and Kate was called to parent me, and the two of us evolved and were transformed through that process. And my kids will laugh ruefully that they are called to parent me on more than one occasion. And it's cute and it's funny and it's sort of true. And I'll be called to parent them. That adoption is that interweaving and mutuality that is important. So that I think that for those of us who are married, for those of us who are single, who are divorced, who are widowed, those are important features of the context in which we open windows for more grace, but they're not the core story. The core story is that sharing of grace. And there's going to be a overwhelming amount of grace that's brought to the world without being married. And the key is to be bringing grace, to be a vessel of that grace, and not to necessarily be in any single identity, even as
Yeah.
we acknowledge that marriage is a great thing. And we're like, I really want my daughters to be married, not because I think they'll be any less without singleness, but because it's this wonderful, hard thing that is great. And if that's not a part of their experience of grace, I'm going to honor the hell out of that too. And I'm going to be so grateful for the, the beauty and holiness and grace that they bring into the world and in whatever form their lives happen to be.
Yeah.
That's my experience of it.
That's really beautifully said. Thank you so much. I feel like that's a good place to wrap up. That was such a good summary. So
Sam,
thank
thank
you.
you so much for your time. And thank you for going a bit over for us. It just was a really rich and interesting discussion. And really
Oh
appreciate your
yeah,
time.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I was just about to say I'm covering the ICU all week, and so I need to go to
Oh,
bed.
yeah, get out of here.
All
But
Go
you
right.
already
save
got there.
Sounds
lives.
You
good.
got there. You saw. You were like you took control and you ended it just at the right time. Good job.
Great.
No, it's good.
All right.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yep.
I hope
Thank
my
you.
daughters. I hope my daughters grow up to be as cool as you two are.
Oh, there is no higher compliment. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening. If you want to continue the conversation with us, we've got a couple of options for you. You're welcome to email us with any feedback or topic suggestions at hello@thesoloists.org. You can also follow us on Instagram. Our account handle is the.soloists. And if you're not on Instagram, don't let us give you FOMO. Enjoy being unplugged from social media. Thanks everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.